First tonight, the European Union has reiterated its solidarity with Nigeria, emphasizing respect for the country's sovereignty. Reacting to the recent comments made by the US President Donald Trump about Nigeria, the EU ambassador to Nigeria and ECOWAS, Gauthier Mignot, said the EU's position was not influenced by external actors, but rooted in its long-standing partnership and shared values with Nigeria. Mr. Mignot said the EU and its member states would continue to respect Nigeria's sovereignty. He acknowledged that while Nigeria faces challenges in the areas of human rights and freedom of religion, its legal and institutional framework provides for fundamental freedoms. The situation is not perfect, he said, but there exists a constitutional basis for the protection of human rights. It is up to the Nigerian authorities to uphold and strengthen this environment of peaceful coexistence. Meanwhile, Nigeria's Minister of Information, Mohammed Idris, has been briefing the press, reeling out what the Tinubu administration has been doing to contain extremist violence and how it's working through diplomatic channels to resolve the impasse with Washington.
Nigeria faces long-standing security challenges that have impacted Christians and Muslims alike. And we mourn every loss of life, knowing that every single loss of life is one too many for this country. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is more than determined to confront and end these security challenges. Since May of 2023, when he took office, Nigeria's security agencies have neutralized more than 13,500 terrorists through sustained operations, and they have arrested over 17,000 suspects who are now undergoing interrogation and prosecution for various offenses. Also, more than 9,800 victims abducted by these terrorist elements, including women and children, have been rescued and have been reintegrated with their families. It is important to restate that the menace of terrorism in Nigeria does not exclusively target any religious or ethnic group. As in many parts of the world, extremism is mindless and it is blind to religion, to class, and to any tribe. It is a war against all peace-loving Nigerians and against the unity and progress of our great country. Therefore, any narrative suggesting that the Nigerian state is failing to take action against religious attacks is based on misinformation or faulty data. Several leading personnel of the very dedicated armed forces of Nigeria and the country's intelligence agencies are Christians working and succeeding alongside their Muslim colleagues in the fight against extremists and criminals waging war against our country and against our values.
And that's the Nigerian Minister of Information, Mohammed Idris there. We will return to assess the things he said at that news conference later in the program with Arise Director of News, Sumner Sambo. That's much later in the program. But first, to get a better steer on what's going on internationally with all of this, I'm joined now on the line from Washington by Arise correspondent Anieze Osakwe. Great to see you again, Anieze. Let's start with the EU, the European Union, and their apparent expression of solidarity with Nigeria following that threat by Donald Trump. How should we read it?
Absolutely. It's good to be with you as well, Charles. And I think that, you really hit the nail on the head in your introduction by talking about how the EU was also just very much talking about the importance of Nigeria maintaining its sovereignty and not being allowed to essentially be distracted by any kind of foreign actors. That's clear, and, they've made their stance crystal clear in that regard. One point that stood out especially to me was how much the EU ambassador, as you said, Mr. Gauthier Mignot, talked about peace. He talked about dialogue, about, the protection of human rights. And just the kind of language that he used was in such a stark contrast to what we heard from America, from President Trump over the weekend. President Trump talked about the possibility of boots on the ground, of airstrikes, of, we talked about guns a-blazing. I mean, the rhetoric is truly like night and day between the EU and the US. And I think that that's a position that Nigeria will have to decide kind of which direction it decides to go in. Another really key point that the EU ambassador to Nigeria and ECOWAS made was the fact that he could be open, or the EU could be open to dialogue with ex-members of bandit groups and terrorist groups. And I think that's an interesting thread because it's a story that we've covered quite extensively at Arise News. Community leaders in different parts of northern states in Nigeria, for instance, Katsina, I know, has held conversations and, open dialogues with these leaders, but it's still somewhat ambiguous where these conversations have led. So it will be interesting to see that if an EU coalition of sorts is part of these conversations, will these peace talks actually lead to something significant? That remains to be seen. But definitely some big highlights from the EU ambassador there talking about these allegations of a Christian genocide in Nigeria.
Well, absolutely, and I think you made a very good point there at the outset when you talked about the contrast between the EU's rather measured language and that of Donald Trump, which came across as quite aggressive. But the EU ambassador Gauthier Mignot did acknowledge, though, didn't he, that Nigeria faces challenges in human rights and freedom of religion, saying that it's up to the Nigerian authorities to uphold and strengthen an environment of peaceful coexistence. What's your assessment of that? I wonder whether there's a subtext in all of that.
Absolutely. I think this really points to the fact that if we're talking about sovereignty, if we're talking about the ability for any country like Nigeria to be able to govern itself, at the end of the day, the buck stops with the Nigerian government. And I think that was a really key point that the ambassador was making, that, the EU can offer support, China can offer support, even America can offer support, and they all have to a certain degree to the Nigerian government, the Nigerian economy. But at the end of the day, when it comes to protecting citizens, when it comes to ensuring security for everyone, irrespective of their religion, it's up to the Nigerian government to do so. There's only so much external actors can do if we really want sovereignty, and if we really are fighting for our sovereignty, which is essentially what we've been doing for the last few days, we need to be able to prove it by protecting our citizens.
Indeed, and as the costs of not containing extremist violence in Nigeria start to look as if they could be quite severe, any sign at all of moves to rebuild diplomatic ties with Washington? I mean, we heard the Minister of Information speaking earlier, and some people have wondered whether that speech should not have been delivered in Washington rather than in Abuja.
Absolutely, and honestly, there have not really been. It seems like we're still in this territory of government officials posting on X. We had another post from the Minister of Aviation, Festus Keyamo, essentially write an open letter to President Trump. We had, like you said, this speech from the Minister of Information, Mohammed Idris, in Abuja. And then just yesterday, we had a press briefing here in D.C. at the White House. And the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, basically said the exact same thing that we heard from President Trump over the weekend, that if the Nigerian government isn't able to get a rein on this alleged Christian genocide, that the U.S. would do some sort of military intervention. So in terms of actual diplomatic talks or any kind of progress, in these more formal avenues of conversations, we have not seen any of that. I did want to point out a quote from Mohamed Idris's speech where he said, and I quote, "President Tinubu is taking the lead in addressing all areas of misunderstanding through diplomatic and political channels." So that was mentioned, but there wasn't really any clarity offered as to what channels or what governments or who exactly President Tinubu has been speaking with. So we'll definitely keep watching that to see if there's any more clarity there.
Absolutely, and we do appreciate the steer, Agnesa, that you've been giving us on these developments. Your coverage from Washington has been really quite sterling, I have to say. But it just going beyond the sort of a narrower focus in terms of what can be done to end the bloodshed in Nigeria. I wonder whether President Trump bringing his voice and his focus to this matter makes it potentially more resolvable. In other words, is it going to take someone like President Trump to do that? Because this has been going on for 15 years, and to date, no one's leading that charge. The voices of the victims are not being heard, and successive Nigerian leaders simply haven't got on top of the problem.
Absolutely, and I'm really glad that you're kind of asking this question in this specific angle, because it's true, at the end of the day, as much as, leaders and government officials have these conversations, they have these back and forths, it's always so important to bring it back to the fact that we're talking about people's lives. In your introduction, you mentioned some of the strides that Mohamed Idris, the Minister of Information, called out, and I have some of the numbers as well. He said that agencies have neutralized more than 13,500 terrorists. They've arrested over 17,000 suspects, rescued more than 9,000 kidnapped people. These are people's lives that we're talking about, and a lot of the reactions that I have seen on social media and online, just responding to these, this issue, is the fact that we wouldn't even have been talking about this right now if it wasn't for that tweet from President Trump. If he hadn't essentially brought it to the fore, despite his use of brash language, we wouldn't have been talking about this. The Nigerian government may not have appointed those ambassadors that, we're expecting to see. And this sense of urgency may not have been there at all. So whether we like it or not, the fact that we're talking about this was essentially set off by that post from President Trump on his Truth Social profile. And, if it can save any lives, if it can improve the security situation throughout the country, then I think that's a step forward for sure for Nigeria as a whole.
You mentioned just a hot second ago the fact that the Minister of Information said that about 17,000 people, terrorists, have been arrested. And somebody on social media was asking, well, where are those 17,000 people? What prisons are they being held in? Because, they're not actually confident that there are any Nigerian prisons that can hold that many people. Meanwhile, the main agents provocateurs, the conservative lawmakers such as U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, appear to be upping the ante. Senator Cruz says that following the designation of Nigeria as a country of particular concern, he now intends to take the next step and hold Nigerian officials accountable. He says he'll be very explicit about who they are in the coming days and weeks. How much is that likely to raise the stakes?
Absolutely. To me, this is one of the biggest threads of this story today. The fact that Ted Cruz put out this video and said that he was essentially going to name and shame a list of, potentially government officials. I read maybe some judges as well, community leaders, anyone that the U.S. deems complicit in these allegations of Christian genocide, as the U.S. has put it. And it's significant because once you're able to put a face to a name, there's essentially no telling as of now what the U.S. government is willing to do. But I've read some reports that we could be looking at visa bans, freezing of assets, and this immediately made me think of when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and we were getting all of those reports about, the British government and the American government imposing sanctions on oligarchs. They were seizing yachts. They were, taking people's, luxury apartments in London and across the world, freezing bank accounts. Is this something that we could see with Nigerian government officials? It's still very unclear, but the fact that Ted Cruz said that in the coming days and the coming weeks that he will be putting out a list of names, I think that's definitely something to watch, and we'll absolutely be following that thread as well.
Absolutely, and thank you very much indeed. We appreciate the work that you're doing there. Anyeze Osakwe is Arise correspondent talking to me on the line there from Washington.